She knew the shadow's name, but didn't dare utter it, or else she would be taken back to the lakeshore, and she couldn't go back there. The shadow kept following her into every memory she had, insisting on talking to her. She fled through those memories to others, but it was still there. "Elizabeth," the shadow would say to her, and the voice was familiar. The sounds of the voice broke her heart for reasons she couldn't understand. It represented something she couldn't handle right now. "Go away!" she screamed at the shadowy figure. Of course, she never uttered these things aloud. Inside, she was frantically trying to escape. On the outside, she simply lay on the bed, unrestrained. The only indication that she retained life was the rise and fall of her chest. You would have to really pay attention to be sure. Her breathing was slow, like she was asleep. But her pink Hello Kitty shirt rose and fell with each painfully slow breath. "Wake up, Elizabeth! You have to get out of here!" the shadow said. It was becoming as frantic as she was. She knew the voice. On the outside, she was no longer alone. He stood there, watching her stare off into space. The door to her room stood wide open, and he had taken a few steps inside. He tilted his head to the right as he considered her. Squish, 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 came the sound of his footfalls as he approached her. His face was bloated, his lips a pasty blue. Algae had started growing in his hair, and he was muddy, his clothes clinging to him. Chad knelt beside his beloved. Inside Elizabeth's mind, the shadow forced her into a corner. She tried to run, but he kept calling her name. Suddenly, it stopped and looked toward the door. "Oh no," it said. At the other end of the hallway, David rounded the corner with his chart in his hands, still whistling. He passed the main entrance, and before he knew it, his foot slid on a wet spot and he was flat on his back. He had almost knocked himself out. He rolled onto his knees, head hanging down, while he tried to catch his breath. He looked over at his chart, which lay face down in a puddle. From this angle on the floor, as he looked beyond, he saw several more puddles along the hallway. The trail disappeared around the corner. Walked was the word for it. The puddles were the same distance apart as footsteps. He reached down into the puddle and, for whatever reason, raised his wet hand to his nose and took a sniff. It was water, but not water out of a faucet. It had a mineral smell. He sniffed again. It smelled like river water or lake water. What the fuck? He struggled to his feet, and as he stumbled forward, soaking wet clipboard in hand, his back twinged. It really hated him now. In Elizabeth's room, the drowned man knelt down next to his beloved's bed, as if to ask for her hand in marriage. Instead, he reached one cold, clammy hand over and turned her face from lying sideways. Her vacant eyes staring through him didn't matter much to him. All he wanted was a kiss, and he would have her forever, like all the other souls he had taken. He leaned in and pressed his hands on her head. One hand held her forehead. One hand opened her jaw. He opened his mouth and leaned further down, pausing about an inch above her. His body heaved, once, twice, and on the third heave, lake water began to pour from his mouth into hers. Inside, the door of her mind burst open. The shadow screamed and disappeared as Elizabeth was swept away in a torrential flood of lake water. On the outside, she gagged. She writhed, but eventually the lake water took its place in her lungs, and the candle that was her life was snuffed out. David rounded the corner, walking slowly, trying not to lose sight of the footsteps and the glare of the bright lights on the white floor. They ended at the last room on the right side of the hallway, Elizabeth Lage's room. Catatonic, according to the chart in his hands, he rushed forward. His first shock was to find the door standing wide open, and when he turned the corner, His jaw fell open in disbelief. "Hey! Hey! Get away from her!" he shouted at the figure hovering over the bed. He flipped on the light and took a step into the room. Yet, when he beheld the figure, he stopped dead in his tracks. The man stood up and regarded him for only seconds before it smiled. "What the hell are you doing?" David took another step forward. Chad tilted his head to the side and slowly began to melt. Water cascaded down his face, pouring onto the floor under his feet, where it gurgled and swayed before it exploded, raining down on everything in the room, including David. David quickly wiped his face, his hands shaking. As his eyes traveled down to Elizabeth, now blue and lifeless, he made his own water. He knew he should have stayed in bed today.